I think it's fair to say that the Gamecube Zelda games, Twilight Princess and The Wind Waker, are some of the most well received in the entire franchise. Well, nowadays. These games are similar in a lot of ways, but are also polar opposites in a lot of areas. Twilight Princess is one of the darker Zelda games with everything getting a more serious tone, and Wind Waker is arguably the most cartoony Zelda game and nothing's really that serious. I love both of these games and I'm sure a lot of people do too, but I also think it's interesting to ask which of these two games is better. That's what I'm going to be talking about in this video, and obviously you can disagree, because at the end of the day it all comes down to personal preference, but with that all out of the way, let's start comparing Twilight Princess and The Wind Waker. I think dungeons are a good place to begin with this comparison, and to start, Twilight Princess has a whole lot more of them. Twilight Princess has 9 dungeons, arguably 10 if you count the Cave of Ordeals, and The Wind Waker technically has 7 dungeons, but really it's more like 6.5 because the Forsaken Fortress is more like a mini dungeon if anything. Having more dungeons is almost always a good thing for Zelda games, and Twilight Princess is better here, but we have to give Wind Waker a pass because it is a much shorter game, and what really matters is the quality of the dungeons anyway. In order to get an idea of the dungeon quality, I'll quickly give my thoughts on each of the dungeons in both games, and then give them a final rating, and we'll see what the average is for both games at the end. Starting with Twilight Princess. The Forest Temple wasn't bad, and it was a good introduction to a lot of the mechanics in the game, and the Gale Boomerang is a great item. Unfortunately, it's pretty long for a first dungeon and definitely more on the confusing side. 6 out of 10. The Goron Mines is a brilliant idea for a dungeon. Exploring this dungeon was definitely interesting at times, and the iron boots attaching to the ceiling is a cool idea for a gimmick, but moving around in the iron boots all the time felt sluggish and the rest of the dungeon didn't provide anything interesting. 5 out of 10. Lakebed Temple has a really good atmosphere and swimming around is surprisingly fun. The puzzles are also good and the hookshot is probably my favorite item in the entire game. If there's anything wrong with this dungeon, it's that the gameplay for the final boss kinda sucks, but it's not by much, so this is still an 8 out of 10. Arbiter's Grounds doesn't really have much of an atmosphere that interests me, and a lot of the enemies are annoying to deal with. Luckily, the Arbiter's Grounds make up for it with an amazing boss, great puzzles, and another one of the best items in the game, the spinner. 8 out of 10. Snow Peak Ruins has a very accurate name because it is peak. Amazing puzzle solving, great boss, and possibly the coolest setting for a dungeon in the entire Zelda series. The ball and chain isn't an amazing item, but it also isn't bad enough to harm the dungeon either. Definitely one of my favorite in the entire series, 10 out of 10. The Temple of Time is also a dungeon that I loved, and I can't really pinpoint why. I just think that there's nothing wrong with this dungeon, and I loved the atmosphere, the boss, the music, the puzzles, and the mini-boss is a dark nut, so this also gets a 10 out of 10. The City in the Sky probably had my favorite atmosphere of any dungeon in the game, and having 2 hookshots is awesome. Unfortunately, the double hookshots aren't utilized as often as I wish they were, and this is by far the longest dungeon in the game. I loved the boss, and I loved the atmosphere, and the item was a great idea, but most of the City in the Sky was repetitive. 5 out of 10. The Palace of Twilight gets a lot of hate and people seem to think that it was underwhelming, but I personally loved the dungeon. I thought that using the Master Sword to get rid of the darkness felt awesome and the puzzles were good, and Zant is also my favorite boss fight in the game. 8 out of 10. The final dungeon, Hyrule Castle, was a lot more underwhelming to me. The areas outside were pretty cool and the build up to the final boss was great as always, but this dungeon doesn't have the it factor that it should. 5 out of 10. All of these scores being combined, the average Twilight Princess dungeon gets a 7.2. Are dungeons in The Wind Waker as good? Let's find out. I, like most people, thought the Forsaken Fortress was pretty bad as a first dungeon. It didn't really teach the player anything other than stealth, which is the last thing you need to be taught in a Zelda game. The second time you arrive at the Forsaken Fortress is a lot better, but the puzzles were still lacking and nothing made the Forsaken Fortress stand out. The only redeeming factor to this dungeon is the 2 bosses, which are amazing, so it still gets a 5 out of 10. Dragonroost Cavern feels like the first actual dungeon in the game, and it is a big improvement. The puzzles are solid, the grappling hook is an awesome item, and the boss is perfect for a first boss fight, but the atmosphere is still pretty basic and it's nothing special. Dragonroost Cavern is a pretty good dungeon though, and it gets a 7 out of 10. The Forbidden Woods is a big example of a dungeon that isn't special or interesting at all. Good atmosphere and all, but the item is boring, the puzzles are mediocre, and the boss for the dungeon is just bad. 4 out of 10. The Tower of the Gods has a pretty interesting atmosphere and I thought the puzzles weren't bad either. Unfortunately, this dungeon also lacks anything making it stand out apart from the boss, which it should have had considering how important this stage in the game is. 5 out of 10. The Earth Temple is where the dungeons step up by a lot, and this dungeon has nearly everything it needs. The Earth Temple has the best puzzle solving in the game by far, and the atmosphere is really unique. The boss is very disappointing, but that's possibly the only reason this dungeon isn't my favorite in the entire series. 10 out of 10. The Wind Temple is very similar to the Earth Temple, but the Wind Temple is a little bit of a step down. The puzzles are lacking a bit simply because the gimmick of planting trees wasn't very interesting, and there wasn't much you could do with it. The hookshot is almost always a welcome addition, and it was utilized a little bit throughout the dungeon, but not nearly enough. Luckily, this dungeon has one of the best boss fights in the entire game, and this boss fight, along with the great atmosphere and layout, makes this dungeon a lot better regardless of its problems. 9 out of 10. The final dungeon, Ganon's Tower, is slightly better than the final dungeon in Twilight Princess. Going through a test based on the previous dungeons is always a good idea, and I had a lot of fun with the gauntlet of bosses in this dungeon. It also has a pretty good atmosphere and alright puzzles. 6 out of 10. That's all of the dungeons in the Wind Waker, and combining these scores we end up with a 6.5 out of 10, meaning Twilight Princess has better dungeons overall. So not only does Twilight Princess have more dungeons, but the dungeons are also higher quality. In this regard, I think it's fair to say that Twilight Princess is better, but dungeons aren't the only thing that matters in Zelda, so let's move on. Before we start talking about the world building and exploration in these games, I would like to remind you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and do all that other stuff. Okay, anyway. World building is very important in the Zelda series, and the worlds in both Twilight Princess and the Wind Waker are very different. It's not easy to compare these two worlds, so instead I'll try to focus on which one was more fun to explore and more interesting in general, starting with Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess is a very fundamental Zelda game, and that applies not only to the design of the world itself, but also the way you explore it. Gradually unlocking the world through the main quest in such a linear way can sometimes feel limiting, but if a game has an overworld with content everywhere, that isn't a problem. Unfortunately, I do feel like a lot of places in the overworld in Twilight Princess feel like something's missing. The overworld doesn't feel empty, but it could definitely use some more content. Luckily, the different settlements in Twilight Princess are full of content, and they aren't similar to one another at all, which sorta makes up for the lack of content in the overworld. Kakariko Village has this charming Wild West feel to it, and Castle Town feels like a huge, densely populated city with stuff constantly happening. Despite the fact that this world map is actually smaller than the ocean in the Wind Waker, it feels massive. The Tears of Light segments may be a pain to go through, but the one upside to these parts of the game is getting to see the world when it's shrouded by twilight, which I thought was pretty interesting. My only complaint when it comes to the world building is that I wish we got to see a little bit more of the Twilight realm, because all we got to see was the Palace of Twilight, which I thought was awesome, and getting to see the rest would have been amazing. The Wind Waker's world building and exploration is basically the opposite of Twilight Princess's, in the sense that it's mostly open-ended and everything is spread out. Although it is true that there's a lot of variety in the different areas of Twilight Princess, I think the 4 settlements in the Wind Waker feel a lot more unique. The different towns in the Wind Waker also feel much smaller and self-contained than in Twilight Princess, but despite this, every town feels like it has its own culture, even more so than Twilight Princess. I think a lot of this is because of how much personality the characters in such towns have, but we'll talk more about that later. When it comes to exploration, I know I said that it was fine in Twilight Princess, but I think it's much better in the Wind Waker. The ocean in this game is very open, and the player can go almost anywhere they want, technically, but you're never able to actually reach most of the important areas on the map until you've obtained a certain item that you can only unlock in the main quest. Basically, you can go anywhere you want on a technicality and do a bunch of stuff, but all of the areas related to the main quest are still reached through a linear path. This gives players a sense of freedom while not allowing them to sequence break the game on accident like you see a lot in modern Zelda games. It is true that the Wind Waker has a lot of filler islands, which probably comes from the fact that the Wind Waker was rushed just like Twilight Princess was, but I honestly don't think the filler islands were much of a problem in the Wind Waker. Even if it was something small like a Great Fairy Fountain, every island provided something useful or interesting to the player. At the end of the day, I think that Twilight Princess has great exploration and world building, but the Wind Waker does it better. Riding through Hyrule Field on Epona and exploring the world was cool, but it never captured the same feeling of adventure that exploring the sea in the Wind Waker did. I'm gonna give this one to the Wind Waker, but we're not done yet, because it's finally time to talk about the story and the characters. Story and characters are the last couple of things I think really matter in a Zelda game, and we could obviously talk about other small things within these games like the combat or something, but I don't think it's worth it. I also do think that the game that wins this category is the better game, and with that all out of the way, let's start by talking about Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess's story is very good, especially for a Zelda game. Midna as a companion makes the story a lot better than it would be without her, since her character is actually interesting and worth caring about, and because Midna has a personal vendetta against Zant, the player actually has a reason to go after him, which goes beyond he's the bad guy who will destroy the world. Speaking of Zant is one of my favorite villains in the entire Zelda series. The twist of him being insane was definitely out of nowhere, but I think it's a cool idea to have a villain who seems calm and tactical just to end up being nothing more than a crazy person controlled by jealousy. Could they have done the twist better? Absolutely, yeah, for sure. But I still loved Zant as a character. The actual villain in the story is Ganondorf, and this would be my favorite iteration of the villain, but he literally shows up at the end of the game, and you don't know anything about him before that. Him showing up on a horse carrying Midna's helmet as a trophy was so baller, but this guy isn't anywhere else throughout the game. My biggest problem at the end of the day with the story in Twilight Princess is that most of the characters involved in the main quest kinda suck. The game tries to make a big deal out of Ilia losing her memory, but I never really cared about Ilia in the first place, so this whole arc kinda fell flat. Telma's whole character revolves around the fact that guys think she looks good, so I don't know why this character even exists, and the characters just aren't that great in Twilight Princess. The only redeeming factor when it comes to the characters really are like Midna and Zant, so it is a very good thing that these are basically the main characters. The story is great, but the characters are terrible, which kinda drags it down. The story in The Wind Waker is also good, but I would say that there's much less of a focus on it up until the end of the game. My favorite part of this story in The Wind Waker has always been the backstory of the Great Flood and how it ties into Ocarina of Time. I know Twilight Princess is also related to Ocarina of Time, but that part of the story felt a lot less interesting than it did in The Wind Waker. The main companion, the King of the Red Lions, wasn't as interesting as Midna, but he was still a great companion with a lot of personality. In fact, the characters in general have a whole lot of personality in The Wind Waker, a lot more so than any other Zelda game. Ganondorf, for example, actually has motivations beyond being a bad guy who wants to control everything, even if that's still his ultimate goal. I think people definitely exaggerate how relatable Ganondorf is in The Wind Waker, but it's undeniable that there's more to his character than in any other Zelda game. Even the characters who have little to do with the main quest are extremely likable, and you could definitely say this is because of the expressive art style, but I don't think that's the only reason. I actually found myself caring more about the side characters than any of the characters important to the main story. If they randomly decided to kill Zelda in The Wind Waker, and then randomly decided to kill Postman Quill, I would have been a lot more sad about the death of Quill. Unfortunately, like I said before, these characters aren't actually important to the main story, which means the story itself isn't affected by these great characters most of the time. That's why as much as the characters in The Wind Waker are great, I don't really care for the story. The story in The Wind Waker isn't bad, and it's definitely better than the story in games like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, but it's not really interesting to me either. This one's a little complicated because although the story and characters go pretty much hand in hand most of the time, I prefer the story in Twilight Princess but prefer the characters in The Wind Waker. It's also difficult to judge because like I said, these games are complete opposites of one another and it's hard to judge stories which are just so different. At the end of the day though, I think I care more about the story in Twilight Princess than I care about the characters in The Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess takes this one. And with everything else in mind, I would say that Twilight Princess is the better game. The Wind Waker does a lot of things right, but I prefer the dungeons in Twilight Princess, the story in Twilight Princess, the combat in Twilight Princess, and the music in Twilight Princess, along with a whole lot of other stuff. Twilight Princess also has a key element in the game that the Wind Waker is simply missing: Telma. Hey, if you made it here, you clearly enjoyed the video. I did not enjoy editing it, but that's aside the point. Click on this video, very similar. Very good video if you ask me, and I don't know what else to say.